Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Mandatory Quarantine Show. And I got my Milky tea here, and you will be pleased to hear that I have my Milky tea. And I got it in a bit of a spooky glass because I actually have this exact same mug that I took over into Russia. And when we got the rental place, this was one of the mugs inside of it. So spooky. Uh, so yesterday had my little freak out. Today I'm feeling much better, much calmer. Probably must have been the wine last night. Beth and we got out some candles and went out onto the back gazebo and drank a glass of wine and just chatted and looked up at the stars. It was a bit of a warmer evening, so that's good. Um, Last night also I decided to kind of freak myself out a bit, of course, and I'm a big fan of history, and I was looking into the big plague of 1650. I was watching a documentary about a street in London and some of the records that they had produced at that time. And it was interesting to see because this was not a historiography from the perspective of kind of the upper class rich white men that you so often see inside of these historiographies. That, well, what did the rich people do? Well, when the pandemic hit inside of London in 1650, they got the hell out of there, was their plan. In fact, the House of Lords, when they finally later met, but it basically put in only about two different regulations, one of which was that, none of the what they called pest houses would be placed anywhere near to anyone of personages of note or status uh, inside of that. And also, I think they voted something along the lines of basically that they wouldn't have to be near people. So that was their big move. The mayor of London was said to have created this gigantic kind of like glass house in which he was able to kind of control this. A lot of the actual response was, of course, done in these areas by their own local constabulary, which was really just people hired by the parish heads inside of it. There was documentation, especially from this period, of like priests fleeing the area, doctors fleeing because doctors at this time were not like on a medical health service like the NHS, or in Canada, like the Canadian Health. It was closer to like the United States system where you just pay for a doctor. And so, of course, when the doctors left with all their wealthy patrons, so a lot of the people that were inside of these places were kind of lay physicians, apothecaries, local women that would go into these areas. And the financing upon this was really upon just the parish in itself to do these sorts of quarantining controls. They read out the exact same protocols that happened in previous plagues, and a lot of them are basically very close to what we see today in terms of like lockdowns and quarantines, in that it was all about moving the sick away from what they considered to be the healthy, but they also had a system which they called lockup. And they believed that this might have also aided in the transmission because if there was one infected person inside of a house, they would just lock the entire house up, or the apartment or whatever. They have records of blacksmiths being paid to, quote, for shackles and locks and etc. being placed on the doors, locking them into these areas. There's a small woodland creature running around. Um, they had records of them being paid an amount of so many shillings of that. Is that a squirrel? It might be a squirrel. He's probably wondering what's that creature doing over there. But they have amounts that they were paid in order to have these amounts. Yes, it is a black squirrel. That's what it is. It's a black squirrel. I was thinking, what's that rumbling behind me? It's a squirrel hunting around. Uh, so new partner on the show, black squirrel rumbling around, just kind of jumping. He's our guest for this hour of the podcast. Um, so they would pay these people to like lock up, and this would be like me going and locking up, like, I don't know, Dr. Suchi's office, like boarding up his office, throwing him in there, putting on all the locks and chains and that. So it's people that you knew that were doing these things, and they would paint them with a red cross over the door, and they would hold them in there for 14, or sorry, for 40 days. I'm only held up for 14, but they would hold them in there for 40 days. And if you've watched some of the previous episodes, you'll know why that is. It's the biblical allusion of this, um, of Jesus going out into the desert. Like, there was no real 14, was just kind of a number that they considered to be the best amount of time. Well, they wouldn't just lock people in there. It wasn't just, okay, we throw you in your house, we lock it up. Because it isn't like today. You don't got a refrigerator, you don't got a pantry. These are, in this area, it was like kind of one of these very village poor areas. So they would have to pay people to be nurses or people and watchmen to watch the door and make sure people didn't get out. And another group which was known as the searchers. And the searchers had the unfortunate task of checking out every once in a while, and if somebody had died, to see that it was from either plague or not from plague. And of course, usually it was plague. But the searchers had those tasks. And again, this would be like if I just walked through the halls and said, okay, uh, okay, Professor Han, you're now the watchman, and you're gonna watch this door. Or Professor this, Professor that, you're going to be the searchers, and you're going to have to go inside of all of these offices and check whether your fellows are dead. So these were absolutely horrible positions, and I mean, it was provided mostly for the poor through the parish through this. There's accounts also in this case of they had basically the burials, and at one point their gravedigger took ill, and so the son, who was the apprentice gravedigger, had to take on and do the burying, and in fact had to bury his own brothers because of the plague in this area. To leave these areas, you would have to basically have writs of yes, you can leave and move off to the country. It was quite the documentary upon all of this and what's inside of it, and we see a lot of these same systemic issues of enclosure of tight spaced people, that it's really the poor that this affects. The rich can run off into the country and be, segregated and live inside of their own space with their own medicines, their own healers, their own pieces inside of this. Another piece, and I think this is maybe bringing us into the fact that it's coming up on Christmas. One of the ideas, again, was that malair, or the miasma, these bad smells that would come off of rotting things that would carry disease. One of the pieces that was used in order to prevent these miasmas is people would carry what were known as pommanders. And these we still make around Christmas, where we get, the orange and you put a bunch of cloves in it. Those were carried by people as prevention from the plague, and we still carry them today as prevention from bad smells inside of our homes around Christmas. So as you're sitting there this year, and you've got your orange and you got your little cloves that you're plugging into it to petrify the orange, let off this very nice smell. And if you've never done this, it's a wonderful activity, especially for kids, to try out and put those cloves into the orange and watch it all kind of shrivel as the liquids are pulled up by the cloves and let off as beautiful smells inside of the house. That was considered protection from it, and would move on into like these, beautiful Victorian pieces of beauty have their guidances from the medieval period of warding off evil miasmas, smells, bad spirits, whatever you wish to kind of clarify them as, came from this idea of preventing these bad smells, these what we know today would be bacteria or viruses, and in the case of plague, flea bites. I guess not really going to deal with that, but the whole fumigation of London was in order to try to bring down the rats. The really sad part of this too, in this whole show also was when they talked about the culling of various animals, because early on they thought that, oh well, since we need to remove miasma, we have to remove, like, various sources of, junk on our streets, and so we got rid of all of the animals in order to prevent that. And so they had massive, massive, massive culls of dogs and cats. And of course, this probably, if anything, let the plague spread worse, because what was going to be eating and destroying all of those rats, which were the main carriers of fleas? Well, it's your dogs and it's your cats. So probably those initial actions to cull those actually led to more damage. And today we have culls in Denmark of mink and culls of sable in Russia, because they are known to get COVID and cause it to mutate. So really, this is, to me, a bit of a, if you do not learn from history, you are doomed to repeat it. And so when people say, oh, well, this is just completely unprecedented, it isn't, sadly. So take a look at 1650. Take a look at 1918 in the Spanish flu. These are all areas in which we have had these types of restrictions and actions in before. So that's my thoughts on a somewhat cloudy and gray Saturday morning. Stay safe, everyone. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and I'll see you next time on the Mandatory Quarantine Show.